thanks everybody to come to this session here, which is the theme session of the Sport and Human Performance Research Centre. My name is Giles Warrington. I'm one of the co-directors of the centre. And what we thought we would do is just showcase some of the work that we've been doing within the centre around the research theme. So I'll introduce my colleagues who will each speak for 10 minutes, and I have a little timer here just to prompt people to stay on time. And then there'll be an opportunity for a round table, some questions around the work of the centre. So thanks very much all of you for coming. So the title we're looking at here is Research-Led Practice in Enhancing Sport and Human Performance. So the centre is very much looking at the broad areas of sport and how we apply our research to enhance human performance. So just a note there, which they put up for all of the sessions there, that the session is being photographed and videoed, and that's taking place. So if anybody has issues with regards to their photograph being captured, if they can just make contact in relation to that, okay? So without further ado, just a little bit of background on the centre before I pass over to colleagues. The Sport and Human Performance Research Centre is a priority research centre in the University of Limerick. It was launched in 2021 by Lord Sebastian Coe, obviously an icon of world sport. So we had a major launch event in 2021 in September. Currently, we have a series of themes within the research centre. Rugby Sport Science, which is led by Professor Ian Kenny, who will be speaking. Esports Science, which is led by Professor Mark Campbell. Endurance Sport Science, led by Dr. Frank Nugent. Athletic Sport Science, led by Professor Drew Harrison. And then myself in terms of weight category sports science. So those are the main themes. We also have emerging themes coming through as well. One of the key ones is coaching science, which is now coming through as an emerging theme, which is led by Dr. Phil Carney and Dr. Ian Sherwin. So those are the real focuses of the work we've been doing. Just to give you a little bit of background in terms of kind of our outputs as a centre, so we were formally launched in 2021 as a priority research centre in the university. However, the work of the centre has been taking place since 2017. And just to give you an indication of kind of our research outputs over this period, 845 publications, and I'll talk about our affiliates and our members of the centre in a moment. Over 500 of those are direct from UL affiliations. And you can see that certainly we've targeted high impact journal outputs, 35% in the top 10% decile, 66% in quartile 1, 54% involving international collaboration. So although we're a centre based in the University of Limerick, we have a national and international remit in terms of collaborations that are taking place within that. To date, we've had 21 PhD graduates, and we have a number of PhD students in the programme, and you'll hear more about that from colleagues as they speak. In terms of our research funding, in excess of 8 million to this point. And currently, our membership is quite large. So it's, as I say, it's both within UL, it's national, it's also international as well. So currently, 73 members involved within the centre. And as I've already mentioned, there's a UL, national, and an international collaborative process, which you can see there in terms of the percentage of international collaborations with regards to the publications. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is hand over to Ian, who's going to speak around the rugby science. So thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Giles. So I'll address the rugby science theme. It emerged initially as the IRIS project, Irish Rugby Injury Surveillance. But there's a lot more has come over the last 8 or 9 years since then. And myself and Dr. Tom Cummins lead the project, but there's a large team involved. And the collaborators there you can see, which has grown initially from Irish Rugby to UPMC, University of Pittsburgh Medical Centre, HRI, with their help and funding with the project, Irish Research Council and European Union Erasmus+. It's all about the people. Initially in 2015, when we sat at the RFU's table pitching a tender with Giles and with Professor Kieran O'Sullivan, Tom and myself, we were asked to present how we would survey injuries nationally for the governing body. It was mandated by World Rugby that all unions across the world had to start doing this as tier 1, 2 and 3 unions. And we wanted to model it on researchers. A lot of what we wanted to do was to mentor people. The work could have been done slightly faster, perhaps with RAs or postdocs, but training people to come through this mode of PhD is really what we wanted to do as a team. Postdoc and alumni so far have been Dr. Karina Yeomans and Dr. Therese Leahy as the initial PhDs setting up the project. Dr. Alan Griffin, Dr. Patrick Dolan have finished recently, and we've a postdoc success as well with Rachel Sheehan, who previously came through with Professor Mark Campbell as well through psychology route. And currently, now we're expanding this, and we currently have 4 PhDs. And as of this morning, another IRC has been assigned as well, Tabby Billingham. And it's now expanded into a range of projects, which I'll detail in a few minutes. But not just injury surveillance, but into coach education, into female player welfare, into World Rugby tackle height trials, and into concussion treatment, which is our collaboration with UPMC. So this is all PhD-led, with several supervisors with distinct disciplines supervising each PhD. And it's a large team. What was really important to the IRFU was that you have interdisciplinary work. So we're indebted to physiotherapy because this is injury-based, to Professor Kieran Sullivan and Dr. Roisin Callan, but also to medical school, to our statistician, which is hugely engaged in the project, Dr. Helen Purtle, not only to analyse the data, but also to design and to answer the questions. I think that's key to any big research project, that you have that person in place. And disciplines of physiology, biomechanics, strength conditioning, interspersed among all. It was just €30,000 per annum initially, per year from the RFU. And over that initial period of 6 years, we expanded into an income now of 2.4 million. But that's just an enabler. It helps us to model PhDs, to get the work out, 19 journal papers, international conferences, and we're at a stage now where we're being invited to present keynotes as experts in the field. And our work has been put into the IOC consensus statement in 2020. So initially injury surveillance, but it's expanded a lot more since then. So some of the projects initially from the first 2 years was injury surveillance. So setting up the project was key. So that's done in a web-based portal you can see on the right. And it's at club level and it's at schools level. A big part of it was the development of this portal. It can't be web-based. It can't be an app. The issues with an app is because the data, and medical data, sits in the app. And until it's uploaded into Wi-Fi or until the app is updated, that medical data sits on somebody's phone. So one of the big issues when we're going for ethics and we're trying to get the IRFU on board for this type of work is making sure the player's data is protected. Once that's set up over the first few years, we're then able to expand the work. And this is where more collaborators have come on board. So for the likes of engaged programs over the COVID period to help people warm up and get ready for training. Tackle height trials with World Rugby. We're now in the middle of a 2-year trial mandated by World Rugby to lower the tackle height, to remove head-on-head contact. So it's a 2-year period now where we're doing this, and this is the first season just finished, and after 2 years they will then be able to report back on the success of that trial, whether has reduced head-on-head contact and concussions. Female player welfare and concussion treatment are some of our newest PhDs. The landscape in Ireland is that we're only looking at about 2,000 players compared to 209,000 playing. So it's not representative, but what was needed by the RFU is a top-down. They track professional game injuries, we track amateur, and we track schools level. So those 2,000 players, hugely important for their engagement and buy-in. But we don't deal with those players. We have a separation. The only person we deal with in our injury surveillance is the medical doctor or the physiotherapist in each club. So it's a separation, so we're not influencing what the players are doing. And 2016 was the inception, and we started collecting data then in 2017. We're the longest serving women's game injury surveillance internationally so far. And other unions are doing this really well now, the Welsh Union, the Scottish Union. But this data is key for World Rugby in terms of how they develop policy. We can compare our data really well internationally against the pro game, and most unions internationally are now looking at male pro game And again, we're the longest serving in terms of underage and schools level. It is in schoolboy and it's senior cup. We have looked at some seasons junior cup. But getting that data is more and more problematic as the lower age you get. And we're now emerging into the women's game as well at underage level. The issue there is that there is not as many games and the competition is not as common. To show some example of what we report back to the RFU, because our main mandate is every year to give this information back, is where injuries occur. So that then the coaches, the medical staff, the athletic development staff can then impact something the year later to take an effect on these injuries. So for example, in the women's game, more facial injuries, and then down to lower body. Some of this stems on them starting the game later in life and not having the 5 or 6 years through their teenage years to develop the skills. We're seeing a little bit in terms of trends for when injuries occur. So spike along the y-axis of when they happen: first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. They differ from male and female. And for schoolboy, we're seeing a lot more shoulder injuries, for example. The development of the shoulder at this younger level is hugely important when the mass of the players are increasing year on year. And just finally, how do we report? So this is where the work actually has an effect. So we're reporting to RFU and in their medical committees, the regional development officers, and then into the schools and clubs. They're developing policies each year about how they train tackles, how they protect the players and what warm-ups they do. And in World Rugby, the data goes into their medical symposia every year. So they can, for example, change laws of the game for engagement at rucks or change laws for tackle heights. Okay. This is the system. I'm not going to dwell on this. I'm going to pass through this. But this is our web-based system. Okay. And happily speak to anybody who wants to contact afterwards to Tom and myself to look at the system. Okay. So thanks for your time, and I'll pass over to Professor Mark Campbell.
Thanks, Ian. So moving from rugby into esports science, or competitive computer gaming as it's also known. So we would have set up the first esports science lab in UL in 2016. So it's the first esports science lab dedicated to esports science in Europe, one of the first in the world. We're over in Lero, where we have a couple of labs over there, and since then we have become a main team within the Sport and Human Performance Research Centre. With that, we work with industry partners, and not only do we develop software for measuring and eliciting individual esports gaming skills or skills in general, we also try to kind of advance knowledge in this burgeoning discipline. So for those uninitiated, computer gaming and esports is massive. There's more people will watch one esport world championship final than will watch the Super Bowl, the Olympics combined. So it's an absolutely massive, massive area with billions of dollars worth of funding within it. But when we actually look at esports science practices, they're a little bit like sports science in the 1980s or the 1970s. So there's a lot of catching up to do, which is great from a scientific point of view for us as a team and as a lab. So fundamentally, if we think about human performance, we're talking about skill. So it always comes back to skill and skill learning. And if we have a look at our little ninja basketball player here, he's doing quite well. So when we think about skill learning, we think about a motor program or a memory for the skill. With that memory, then, we send some signals from our premotor cortex, motor cortex, to our fingers and hands in this case, and we perform some kind of an action, so shooting for the basket or whatever. We get sensory feedback then from occipital areas of our brain back to motor cortex. And this feedback loop is complete whether we make our shot or miss our shot. So this feedback loop gets strengthened if we make our shot. I did something right there, my technique was good. So we refine that motor program which is there. And if we miss, then we might alter that motor program subconsciously or consciously to tweak it, and that feedback loop continues and continues. So essentially what I'm saying is we're really interested. Skill starts with psychology, starts with neurocognition. It starts with this idea of having a memory or a motor program for what that skill is, and then we refine that over the course of iterations of practice and doing it. In the case of computer gaming, it's a little bit smaller. It's smaller movements. We think about esports as mainly PC gaming, so it's WS, A and D on your keyboard and your mouse. So very fine sensory motor skills. So if we think about this idea of a continuum, esports and computer gaming is the new bridge and the new chess. It's primarily a mind sport, or we call them cognitive athletes. So the influence of cognitive skills within these sports is much greater than in some of the other sports. So we have this kind of a continuum here from 2018. Okay, just some numbers now to kind of give you a bit of a context about gaming, because we tend to think about gaming in a really stereotyped way. We tend to think of 13 or 14-year-old boys in their parents' basements playing games on their own, which couldn't be any further from the truth. So 50% of gamers are in the 18 to 40 bracket at our last kind of estimate, and increasingly getting older, because 40-year-olds, 45-year-olds like myself are the OG gamers of this generation. We would have started with Commodore 64s and all sorts of little things like that. And most of us are still gaming. So the average age of a gamer is 33 and rising. The percentage of gamers who are females is 42 and rising. So a lot more than people would think. There's dedicated gaming events, professional leagues called Girl Gamer for just women in sports. And it's a new project we've just taken on within the Lero Esports Science Lab, which is looking at women in gaming and specifically studying women and the skills required, because there shouldn't be any difference if it's primarily a mind sport in terms of sex-based differences for performance. And then when we look at esports, there's about 10 main esports, and they compete in leagues much like most of our mainstream sports. The shocking thing really with esports is the average age of retirement of an esport professional. 23. So most people are leaving college at the moment. These guys are retiring. And so a lot of the work we do is looking at life after esport. So what skills do these people possess that might be good for other occupations? They have a lot of high-performance human-computer interaction, digital intelligence, skillful, efficient communication, and this idea of enhanced cognitive abilities. So we did a big review a few years ago, and we found that one of the main occupations that former esports pros would be ideally suited to is air traffic control, drone operators, etc., etc. So that kind of high-performance interaction with in a digital environment. Gamers make better laparoscopic surgeons as well, because of this idea of an interaction with a digital environment. And for us, this idea of esports is it's a beautiful natural lab to study psychology, nutrition, biomechanics, all of the range of sports science, because we have so much experimental control over what's happening within that environment. So it's a really nice natural lab. So this came out in 2015 from Red Bull, who put out this kind of just an ad about what makes an e-athlete, and this would have piqued my interest at the time in terms of all the different possibilities within this natural lab. So you have your biometrics, you know, the brain, the neuro side of things, you have the skill learning side of things, you have the physical side of things, which might be lesser, but you know, the idea of people retiring at 23 is because they think they have their reaction times are slowing down and they're getting worse at their game. But I mean, it's total nonsense. So we're setting out to try to disprove a lot of this kind of stuff. So if we think about gaming performance, then we think about all of these areas. It's such a multi and interdisciplinary area requiring skills and skill sets within some of these domains. So sports science graduates are ideally suited really to studying esports science, because there is an element of biomechanics, there is an element of kinematics, nutrition, psychology, neuroscience, computer science, data analytics. It's all there within esports science. So I mentioned the really old, outdated practices of some of these esports teams, who would be massive teams with huge budgets. Average salary of an esports pro is about $300,000 a year at the moment. So there's a lot of money to be made within these industries, and there's a lot of poor practices happening here. So basically what they still do to this day is they still play up to 7 or 8 hours a day of just the game themselves, which they call scrims. So we would know from sports science that this is a really poor practice. And a nice study of this was Walter Booth in 2010, who looked at this idea of full immersion training, FET, or variable priority training, with the game that they just designed called Space Fortress. And obviously after, 4 sessions of variable priority training, training your mouse tracking on its own, training your keyboard skills on their own, after 4 sessions you're significantly better at playing that game than if you were just playing the game constantly in this full immersion training. So what we started to try to do then within the esports team and within the lab was we started to try to develop tests to measure these individual gaming skills. And we started developing software tests to try to capture some of these as well, because it's a lovely digital environment. So I mentioned they're cognitive athletes. So when we think about cognition, we think about maybe these key areas: executive functioning, working memory, attention span, psychomotor speed, and memory, because everything starts with memory for that motor program, for that whole idea of skill learning. So we're really interested in that whole continuum of strengthening this motor program, what it actually means and how you might study it. And we started testing university students here a few years ago, and we noticed that compared to our sports science students who didn't game and our sports science students who did game, bad news for the people who didn't game, they didn't have this idea of processing speed and task switching from one task to another, divided attention, etc. This idea of cognitive control or inhibiting a response you want to make to actually stick to a task at hand. And people who played 7 hours a week of an action video game was the term we were looking for, the types of gamers. Those people who did that had all these superior cognitive skills. And these are mainstream tests of cognition. They're not gaming tasks or gaming tests. So they have better cognition, either because they're attracted to gaming, or maybe there might be a cause and effect type thing, which some early research is coming out about that now. So I came up with this term myself. I was really proud of it at the time, but ever since I'm not so sure. So gaming ability-based tests for esports, GATES. And these were software tests which were measuring individual gaming skills, so mouse tracking, flick speed, accuracy, tracking, etc. And we've been working with Logitech since 2016, so we have about a 10-year relationship with them now. We have we're going to have 15 members of the lab and a few more members of the team as well. And we were the first research group within Lero to successfully license the IP that we developed on this project to sell to Logitech, who have now launched a product called Playmaster, which is a coaching software-based tool for doing individual tests for a game called Counter-Strike. At the moment, they have about 400,000 users, so it's a really nice kind of a successful showcase of what can be done, from an academic standpoint in a lab with, a multidisciplinary team of a software engineer, a psychologist, a biomechanist initially, and where we can go with that in terms of developing software tests which can have a real kind of a measurable kind of an impact. Then finally, I suppose, we talked about life after esports and life after competitive computer gaming. We're also interested in their health and their human performance. It is the Sport and Human Performance Centre, but health forms a big part of that as well. So some of the other types of things we've done is a lot of engagement with EPE or podcasts or getting the information out there. We've done some studies. We talked about scrimming earlier, where we talked about 7 to 8 hours of training a day just playing this game. So that's very bad from a physical activity, sedentary behavior point of view. So we've done some kind of training studies which have shown that 10 minutes of training one skill a day can be improved significantly after 4 bouts, so 40 minutes of training. So that's a huge message to get out to these individuals and these teams, that you don't need to play for 7 hours a day. More is definitely not more. Less is definitely more if you have smarter science-based sports science principles behind you, which we have been able to effectively demonstrate. So that's it. Thank you.
So guys, I'm covering the Endurance Sport Science team of the Sport and Human Performance Research Centre. My name's Frank Nugent. The Endurance Sport Science team has been in existence for about 3 years now. So it's a much smaller team than many of the other teams. We currently have 3 PhD students. We're growing every year. So we have 1 PhD student in the area of rowing performance, 2 in the area of rowing performance and 1 in the area of swimming. So when I say endurance sports, we're looking at sports like swimming, looking at sports like rowing, triathlon, cycling. In theory, an endurance sport is a sport that's predominantly aerobic in nature, and that's a sport that's cyclical in nature, and generally anything that's over 60 seconds of maximal activity, and that's cyclical in nature. So they're the sports that kind of fall into our remit. These are some of the current projects that we have, and some of our collaborators as well. A lot of the work over the past 3 years has been in the area of rowing performance, and you might have seen the success of the UL rowers over the past number of years. A lot of that has been kind of linked in with UL Rowing Club as well, and we've been quite fortunate that we've had a lot of collaboration with World Rowing, who are the international governing body as well. We had a number of papers published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, 6 in total. British Journal of Sports Medicine is the #1 sports science journal out there, highest impact factor, and they were all on the area of low back pain. So the prevention and management of low back pain, it was the first ever consensus statement in that area. We've also done some research on resistance training practices in rowing, talent identification and development, and now we're doing some work on water and off water biomechanics. So as a research team, we cover physiology, biomechanics, and strength and conditioning as well. So the majority of areas of performance. We're also doing some work with cycling as well, around bike position optimization with Sport Ireland Institute and Trinity College, and there's some ongoing work as well on swimming performance too. A key focus of this research centre is translating research into practice. Personally, as a team lead, I don't see the point in publishing a research paper that just sits there and never gets read. It has to solve real world problems for endurance sports. And I think we have some evidence to suggest that we're starting to make inroads in that area. The low back pain research that we did, there was 6 publications in total. They were published in a high impact factor journal, but also they were published in a plain language format, an infographic that went out through World Rowing. And we know for a fact that these clinical guideline on treatment of low back pain is being used by NGBs worldwide. So impact is a key element of that. Another example of that is some research that was done recently on resistance training and practices in rowing. Again, it was published in a journal, but the findings were also published via World Rowing as well. So it's not just sitting there. The last example of that is some work around kind of strength and conditioning practices in sports like swimming and in rowing. And these papers have been integrated into NGB's coach education pathways as well. So that's our kind of key focus for this research team. It's been in existence for 3 years now, and we're trying to build capacity every year, trying to get more research aligned to other sports like triathlon and running as well. So that's really everything from me in that area. To Drew.
Okay, I want to talk to you about the athletic science theme, particularly the FAST programme, which is a major part of the athletic science theme at the moment. So what is FAST? FAST stands for the Feasibility Analysis of Sprint Start Technologies. So we're interested in mapping the kinetic sequence, the force sequence that occurs when somebody does a sprint start in athletics. So we look at sprint start response time, mechanical delays in the sprint start, hand and block response times, and I'll show you why that's important later, and looking at how we actually detect the event of the sprint start activation. So the motivation for our research is really to try and make the sprint start in athletics fair, and to provide technology that supports the officials in making decisions about whether a sprint start has been a false start or a legal one. We want to ensure that the detection of the start reaction time is objective and judgments and disqualifications are correct. And also we're trying to help World Athletics to have the strongest possible scientific basis for the decisions that they make. So some of you might know, and some of you probably do know, but you might not realise that starting after the gun goes may result in a false start. It's not just about making sure you start after the gun, it's making sure that you start more than 100 milliseconds after the gun, because there's a delay between the gun firing and making a sound and the athlete being able to respond to that. It's basically called a reaction time. And the IAAF, now World Athletics it's called, set that at 100 milliseconds delay. So if an athlete starts in 99 milliseconds, potentially they could be disqualified. And that happened in Oregon at the World Championships in 2022. Okay, so this 100 millisecond rule is very contentious. The scientific justification for that rule was based on one study that's up there on the screen of about 8 experienced athletes in Finland. The study didn't actually recommend that the reaction time limit is 100 milliseconds, but the IAAF, through its committees, came up with that nice round figure. What are the time delays? Well, there's various sources, like the time it takes for the sound to get to the ear, the time it takes for the detection from the ear to get to the brainstem, the time to delay between the brain detecting a sound or detecting an event and activating the muscles. All in all, these delays amount to between 110 and 147 milliseconds. About 140, 150 milliseconds. And in practice, reaction times average in athletics about 150 to 180 milliseconds. But there's real technical problems. This is a study that was done by Stefan Willwacher in 2013. And you can see in here that these are start detections, reaction times that are detected in 4 different sets of blocks. And you can see all of them are robot. A robot was actually detected, was generating the force pattern. And the same force pattern is applied in 4 sets of blocks. And the systems display different reaction times. You can see this one, this demonstrates a longer reaction time. There's a validity problem with this system. Okay. But if we look at system 4, there's lots of variance, and these are all the same reactions, the same cluster of reactions. And that means there's a reliability problem with that system. So why would that occur? If you look at it in detail, there are 2 main causes for these types of validity and reliability errors. One is that there are different detection algorithms. So the event is detected when, in this case, when the signal from an accelerometer goes above a certain variance threshold. Okay? And with different variance thresholds, you get different delays. You also get different responses if you use a force transducer rather than an accelerometer. However, the same 100 millisecond rule applies. This is a problem. And now I'm just going to look at some real data from a 2022 World Championships. And you can see this is actually a false start. And if you look down here with the blue arrow, it points to where the force rises in the blocks. But the actual detected time is that red line where the red arrow is pointing to. There's a delay, and it's caused by this variance type threshold. It's not a very good algorithm. The true response should have been about 495 seconds before, 495 milliseconds before the gun, and it detected 379 milliseconds before the gun. Both were false starts, but you can't really have an error like that. Now the picture gets more complicated when you start to look at the hand forces. And this is data from a study that was done in, I think, 2010 by Komi and Ishikawa. And this shows that the reaction time for the arm force is 69 milliseconds on average, whereas the onset of block force, the leg reaction time, is 98. So the reaction time is dependent on what you actually measure, whether you measure the feet or whether you measure the hands. It stands to reason that we should actually measure the first reaction time. The one that we can measure easiest is, and the first reaction is the hands. The question is, why was it ignored? Because it was easy to do blocks. So we came up with the idea of actually building our own force plate to measure the hand reaction time. And we built it and we started measuring it on a simulated competition. And you can see from here that the reaction time, which is detected by looking at the force, we did it visually by visual inspection, but compared with the IAAF, or World Athletics Approved System, it was 76.9 and it was 138. There's a big difference. And it's also different levels of variation here, which means you can't predict one from the other. That's a major problem. We looked at it extracting the false starts and we get a similar result. And so what we appear to have is a proof of a concept that hand reactions occur before the block reactions. So, and you can't predict the hand reaction from the block reaction. You need to measure the first response. However, we had a problem. We needed to reduce the force plate to something more manageable. And you can see what we did over a period of a few years. We developed this hand plate that sits in the ground with a force sensor. It's about the size of the chip in your credit card. Okay? And we put high quality sensors in the blocks. And we did more experimentation. We checked that our low profile hand plate was able to do similar measures to a lab-based, very precise hand plate. You can see they're quite similar here. There's a little bit of error, but they're pretty good. Okay. And we also had to refine an algorithm that could do the event detection. That took a few years, actually, of work and 3 PhD students. And we came up with this thing called the constraints algorithm. And you can see what it does is it's detecting this inflection point, which is where the force rises. So we have a better algorithm. Okay, but we need to test this in more and more subjects. Okay, we looked at applying the constraints algorithm versus on hands and blocks, and you can see we get 72 on average, 72 milliseconds, much less than 100 milliseconds, whereas it's about 138 milliseconds in the blocks. Okay, so we need a different rule as well. 100 milliseconds would be unfair. Human beings can react quicker than 100 milliseconds if you measure the hand reaction time. We looked at visual versus the constraint algorithm, and you can see that the constraint algorithm is actually better than a more subjective visual detection. And it would be automatic if we program it into the computer. So the conclusions are that measured response times are affected by the technology. The current sprint start information systems that are used in competitions use different types of sensors, different event detection algorithms, but the same 100 millisecond rule applies. This is not a good situation for world athletics. In the sprint start sequence, hand force appears before the block force. We're pretty sure about that. It happens in nearly every single start that we've ever measured. And you might think, if we improve these things and it matters for, say, 10 or 12 milliseconds, right? You might think, well, what does that matter? Every millisecond in an international 100-metre race in men represents about 1 centimetre of distance in the race. It's important. That millisecond can be detected very easily when you look at the finish. So changes in the rules will be required to achieve a greater fairness in the sprint start. We tried to influence world athletics. We brought Seb Cole over to Ireland, and he saw it for himself, so he's aware of it, and world athletics are aware of it. And we also tried to influence by publishing our work. And we have 4 patents on the system as part of the work. So it's a very focused project, but the effort is to try and influence what's happening in the sport and make a change. So if you see the hands being measured in the sprint start in 10 years' time, you'll know it's actually arising from the work that's come from the Sport and Human Performance Research Centre. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so over to me to wrap up then. So just the final research theme is currently entitled Weight Category Sport Science, which is led by myself and colleague Sarah Jane Cullen. Originally, much of the focus was in weight category sports, but we've grown as a research theme, and you can see there's a variety of areas around weight category sports, but also looking at things like body composition, energy availability, nutrition, hydration assessment, weight regulation, psychological effects of making weight, and disordered eating disorders. So we're looking at possibly changing our theme title based on the groupings that we have within the theme. So that just gives you an indication of the theme members. So we have 19 members at the moment from a diversity of backgrounds and areas, from academia, UL and other partner institutions, but also some industry-based individuals as well, and also individuals from the UK as well. So a kind of a diversifying theme is probably the way to look at it. What I thought would be useful in the short time I have is maybe just to give one case study of kind of one of the original elements of the theme was around the jockey research programme, which is obviously a core hub of that. And it was really about an opportunity, and it was a little bit of luck possibly related to that. So the gentleman in the top left-hand corner here is Dr. Adrian McGoldrick, who was the Chief Medical Officer for Irish Horse Racing Regulatory Board, rang me out of the blue one day to say, I've got a high-profile jockey who's having a problem making weight, and would you see him? And I think the idea was that he would come in, we'd have a conversation, and maybe run a few tests on him, and that would be that sorted. Now, the individual there, and I can disclose that because he's publicly talked about this himself, is Johnny Murtagh, who was a leading jockey at the time. So Johnny came down, we had a conversation with him, and I asked him just to chart through his daily activity, his daily routine. And he described kind of abstinence from fluid intake, abstinence from nutritional intake, high work schedule, getting up early, riding out horses. So my kind of jaw hit the floor after about half an hour. And I asked him a question, is when do you hydrate? And he said to me, let me think, October. So that gives you an idea of the chaotic environment. So interestingly, we did that work, and around that time, there was 2 fatalities in the horse racing industry. And they set up a health and safety committee, and one of the typical recommendations was we need to do research. But they didn't know what it was. So based on that, we did our initial research study, which is where the research programme has really blossomed from. And what is interesting, you can see Johnny in the bottom corner there as well. He's now retired, but he's now a very successful horse racing trainer. So all of the things that we would have worked with him over his later career, he's now imparting that knowledge and information to young aspiring jockeys. So again, a great role model for the programme. So this was the original paper that was published, where we took a group of 30 experienced jockeys, and we did a physiological profile on them. And we looked at a number of parameters, and what was quite startling was the high levels of dehydration, both on non-racing days and particularly on racing days, but also the high levels of poor bone health. So osteoporosis, which you're probably all familiar with, brittle bone disease, the stage or precursor to that is osteopenia. And we found that within the jockeys that we assessed using DEXA, 40% had osteopenia. So you think of horse racing, it's a high-risk injury-related sport. So a jump jockey, 1 in every 10 rides, they'll come off the horse. And the analogy we use is imagine sitting on top of a mini roof rack in a crouched position, a forward propulsion, and then the car going along at about 45, 50 kilometers an hour, and suddenly the brakes don't come on very quickly. So that's what we're seeing. So it's a related incidence within that. We also found that over 60% of the jockeys that we had in the study had a current injury. So again, it's not a good profile in terms of what we're seeing. So this was the first study that led to much further research taking place. So within the program to this point now, we had research funding approaching 1.5 million, principally coming from industry, but also partners like the IRC as part of that. We've published 30 peer-reviewed journal publications and also over 30 conference publications and abstracts. Currently, we have 3 PhDs and 1 master's student who have completed their studies and also 2 postdocs. Currently, there's 7 doctoral students within the program. But again, one of the things we're talking about is translation of information and knowledge. So some of the key outcomes that have come from this research is the minimum riding weights for flat jockeys have increased on 2 occasions since this research has been done, which is the first time in over a century. So if you think that the average male jockey, a 13-year-old schoolboy couldn't make the minimum weight riding standard for a male adult jockey. So that just gives you an indication. So based on evidence-based research and those findings, recommendations were made to the regulatory bodies and the minimum weight standards have risen on 2 occasions. We've also established what we call a jockey pathway. So looking at from very young jockeys, apprentices, trainees, right through into professional jockeys and retirees, we've developed a pathway program where we're developing support structures around jockeys at different stages of their growth, development and their careers. And based on that as well, we've developed an evidence-based sports science medical support program, so they can now access sports science and medical support services similar to the Institute of Sport with carded athletes, whereas previously jockeys wouldn't see themselves as athletes, and they just go on and do the riding. And all the information they were gathering was historical, traditionally handed down from jockey to jockey. So we now have an evidence-based education program and sports science and medical support program for the jockeys. It is a high injury, high risk related sport, so to bear that in mind. So again, just to give you a kind of flavour of the research in this particular area of the weight category sports theme, Adrian McGoldrick was the Chief Medical Officer. He's still a practising racecourse doctor. Dr. Jennifer Pugh is the current Irish horse racing medical officer, and then some of the key researchers, Sarah Jane Cullen in physiology, Gillian O'Loughlin in nutrition, Ciara Losty psychology, and Siobhan O'Connor looking at injury epidemiology. And then you can see in the middle there we have 4 of our graduates, all working in academia now in various research and academic roles, with the exception of Mikey Kiley, who's working in high performance sport as head of athletic development with Connacht Rugby. And then you can see underneath there we have a suite of PhD students who are currently looking at various aspects within the horse racing industry, not just in relation to jockeys, but we've broadened it to look at other domains within the Irish horse racing industry. And again, underneath there, you can see some of our collaborative partners in other academic institutions and some of the funding agencies that have supported the work to date within the programme. So just to give you that flavour within that. So that's me, very briefly, okay? So we're well on time. So what I'm going to ask is, colleagues, we might just come and sit at the chairs here. There's an opportunity for a round table Q&A, so anybody who would like to ask some questions around the work of the centre and kind of future directions. Because it's being recorded, so I think they're on there. Okay. I might just start off talking to colleagues now. In the area of sport and human performance, what do you see, either in your domain or in general terms, future opportunities? Where do you think the directions of research within the area of sport and human performance would go? I might start with Drew.
Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah, okay. I think in the area that I'm working in, it's really about influencing change in the rules, and that would take a long time being 5 years, maybe more. Even though we have a system that appears to work quite well, it's really about implementing change in the rules and changing the technology, and it would make the event fair for athletes. That's what we are trying to do.
There seems to be a change to connections with health. So a lot of the work that we do are not just performance related, but health related as well. It's a great enabler as well with the funding agencies and the current status of funding in Ireland that it's health related, the Health Research Board, IRC. It's a particularly difficult area for funding to be obtained. So as an enabler for our PhD researchers and our collaborators doing work in that health domain to try to protect the athletes, but then when they're protected, for them to perform as best they can is, I think, it's been a shift over the last 15 years or so for the research element for health.
No, it's working. Technology is the big thing in all aspects. You know, I work across the area of strength and conditioning, physiology, and primarily in the kind of research area, biomechanics, and technology. It's just flying ahead. It's hard to keep up with. And I suppose as researchers, we're always questioning the validity, the reliability of that technology as well before we actually use it. Even when it comes to, like, as a strength and conditioning coach, physiologist, prescribing a program to someone, you know, you used to be able to get away with just things like heart rate, and now it's changed so much. You know, everyone has GPS units on them now, whether it's in their watch or on the back of their top. Everyone has Fitbits, and that's expanding into the area of health as well. So technology is the buzz thing now, and combining the coach's eye with objective data. I think that's where you really get a strong, informed decisions around training practices.
I think technology as well, much like Frank, but I think data analytics and being able to train people up who have different skill sets really for how future sport or future human performance might look like. So I don't think just specialising in one area is going to really cut it moving forward. I think you need to be able to you know, maybe combine two specialisms together. So I think data analytics and coding, and even the ability to interact with software in much more meaningful ways than we can already is definitely a big part of that. Establishing the knowledge base and then being able to get trained, scientifically back people out into these professional domains.
That's great. I think in the area of sports science, we've been quite traditionally siloed thinking, and I think building on Mark's comment there, moving to that multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary approach to problem solving is a key thing. Ian, you mentioned the challenges in terms of securing research funding in the sport human performance space. I think everybody's been successful here. How have you leveraged that? I might start with you, Mark, in terms of just the funding. And
how you might leverage funding. I think it's about relationships at the end of the day. I think you know, I've been lucky with Logitech and Nvidia and some big tech kind of companies, but they all started really small. They all started with a meeting where you were engaged and enthusiastic, and you brought some new information to the table that they didn't have, and you were able to kind of show them what we could do here, and do what you say you're going to do, and do it on time, and all the things that academics don't have a reputation for doing, really. So I think if you can do that, it's a great start. I think there's a lot of funding out there in different places that might start quite small. So, you know, the Esports Science Lab started with a one-year postdoc contract, and the funding model was very different back then. It was a multiplier of 2.2. So for 25 grand, Logitech got a postdoc for a year. They did that 1-year project. They were happy with the deliverables and the milestones, and then they committed to, several more. So I think I wouldn't be afraid to start small and just kind of build on that.
Yeah, I'd be a bit of a rookie in this area. So like, I think it's really about sitting down with industry partners and talking to them about real world problems, and showing them how you can help solve them. I think sometimes in sports science, sports scientists get a bad reputation with regards to collecting data, and then the transition time between the collection of that data and actually doing something with that data and coming back with that data and informing the team as to how this data is useful for them. We can get a bad reputation in that area. So it's about sitting down, identifying the problems with the organisation, with the industry partner, and being like, okay, we can solve this, and putting effective timelines in place. I think the worst kind of research is that research that sits there and never gets used. It has to solve real world problems and have impact.
I'll focus on some of our work, which is industry-led. You do need to start small, and that's usually through us with master's projects. So proving to an industry partner over a 6 or 12-month period that you can deliver something at that level, and then have something ready to pitch to them. So some of our industry partners might be looking for a particular question answered, and once the master's project or the small work might be delivered with them, then you ask them, will we collaborate on something larger? Now that we've proven something has been done, and to have a template with an outlay of PhD or RA or postdoc that they can then look at with their board of management and deliver on that. So I think that's key, to have something ready that industry will attach to. It can't be cold. You need to build that relationship firstly, and that can take 6 months. It might take 3 years for them to trust you.
Yeah, in our case, it's actually quite complicated to get funding. I think the problem is that in sport, certainly in athletics, they want to see a working system that's working live in real time. That's a complete invention, to actually create that thing from scratch. And we've had to work on a shoestring really with IRC students and things like that. I think once we would be able to put all the computer technology or the computer algorithms and have it working in real time, then you might get funding from the sport to test that system so that it could be implemented. That would flow. But you have to do the hard bit first, I'm afraid, in producing new technology that's actually going to upset the whole thing, result in, they call it technologies that disturb, the status quo. And you have to actually do it and have it working, prove the concept, before you might then be able to get funding from the timing companies who are then forced to implement that whole thing. So for example, there's no timing companies in Ireland, so SFI are not interested. They can't really see where an Irish company is going to deliver an international sprint start system. So it's difficult, and really you have to work on the problem and solve the problem first. But I think if we have a working system, then the likes of athletics, world athletics, might change the rules or contemplate a change in the rules and fund, mass testing of that on international athletes. I think that's the way forward. But by that time, we'll have actually solved the problem. It's just really a rollout that you'll get funding for.
Okay, opportunity to open it to the floor. Is any questions you want to ask the panel? Ola.
Thanks very much, everyone. It's really interesting to hear the diversity of work taking place. I have a couple of questions. First for Mark, maybe. Just for my own curiosity, so you described eSport athletes as cognitive athletes. Do they see themselves as athletes?
They do. There's a whole spectrum, really. So when we're talking about esports professionals, it's like tier 1 and tier 2. It's a bit like Premier League and First Division in soccer. you know, they've signed big contracts, they're on big money, they live in a team house, they train all year round, they travel, they get 1 month off, it's an 11-month season, you know, it's insane. But then when you look at the collegiate scene, maybe there's quite a thriving collegiate scene in other countries. It's kind of getting up to speed here. Some of them mightn't describe themselves as cognitive athletes, no.
Interesting. And obviously then, as the faculty funding officer, I'm going to follow the money. So I suppose the industry, the esports industry, I mean, the amounts of money you're talking about, people getting paid, it's mind-blowing. Is there a culture in the industry in terms of investing in research and development? You know, in other industries like pharma, there's obviously a very strong culture there. Does that exist?
It does exist, but it's very much in-house. It's a bit like Formula One, so it's a bit like black box. You know, we've done all this in-house, and we have all these practices and so on. So it's very hard to kind of to break into some of those. So Fnatic would be a very large esports franchise. You know, they'd own multiple teams across multiple game genres. They have an R&D center. So when I say the Lero Esports Science Lab is one of the first in the world, as far as I can tell, it is the first in the world, but there are a dozen or more in-house ones, even with NVIDIA, for example. They would have an in-house R&D based around gaming performance and, you know, that kind of system, latency and system refresh rates and how that impacts on, you know, human performance. So there's a lot of proprietary type of research going on that they are spending money on, but it's NDA and all that kind of stuff as well. So it's kind of hard to leverage some of that unless you've kind of established yourself as someone who can add value to what they're trying to do.
So the expertise that you bring then is the selling point in terms of...
Yeah, very much so, yeah, big time.
Excellent, thank you.
Hi all, really interesting and really great to see this research within UL being conducted. Just in relation to health, and I suppose this question is predominantly for eSport again, I'm particularly interested in movement behaviours. And you mentioned there that you were measuring certain things. You had the diagram of nutrition and various other health-related measurements. Has there any research been done in sit-to-stand desks to promote maybe, you know, there's this connotation, sit less, move more? And secondly, in your studies and in your research unit, is that a residential, like 24-hour Big Brother style research being done where you can measure sleep as well in these athletes?
I'll start with the last bit there. We had, Giles would know this well as well, we had an Australian PhD student who was looking at sleep. To get it through ethics, we called it extended wakefulness, so 30 hours of extended wakefulness. So he would have, Tim Smithies was his name, he would have done a lot of research on you know, the effects of sleep deprivation on performance, and you know, he's trying to publish some of that research at the moment, so it's really cutting edge. In terms of the physical activity, sedentary behavior type stuff, there's starting to some research to come out there. There's a really good researcher over in New York, Joanne Donahue, who's doing kind of activity breaks during gaming practice sessions. So, you know, getting up, walking around every 15 or 20 minutes or whatever, and there's been some nice kind of performance-related findings off the back of that. But I think there's a huge opportunity for sedentary behavior type research there, because there's very little so far. And when we talk about esports science, there's very little in that area too. So it's about kind of bringing mainstream knowledge into it to try to establish that kind of newer knowledge base as well. I think I got your questions there. No Big Brother stuff, no Big Brother stuff.
It would be really interesting to see if there was an impact on performance and sedentary behaviour. But yeah, thank you.
Just on the point around health, I mean, with the jockeys and weight category athletes, you know, they're extremely fit and physically active, but they're not necessarily healthy in terms of the energy restriction being a key thing, and we saw that in the data. So you've got a kind of a contradiction that if you were to assess them physiologically for a number of aspects, you say, yeah, they're very fit, but when you actually sort of delve under the surface a little bit, you'd see that they're extremely unhealthy, some of them as well, and poor lifestyle practices, so which is interesting.
Hi, I have a question for Mark again. Very interesting research, just in terms of these gamers, they have increased cognitive abilities. So looking at the flip side, with people, cognitive decline with the aging process, are you kind of looking into using that to try and improve their cognitive abilities as they age and stuff?
There's some really good research by a fellow called Adam Ghazali over in San Francisco looking at a game called Neuro Racer. And Neuro Racer is just a game designed with kind of spatial abilities in mind, and it's been really nice research published in Nature about trying to maintain or augment that kind of cognitive issues with active aging. We haven't looked at it within the team yet, but there is some really, really cutting edge research out there. And when we talk about the cause and effect of cognition, there's some early research out of the States looking at this idea of whether playing games actually causes, hippocampal volume increases or decreases. And a guy called Stark has got some very early evidence for that. So it's not as clear cut as we think, but there is a kind of a, playing games does make you smarter, kind of a link there that's starting to show.
And are you kind of looking at any kind of brain imaging, blood flow parameters in the brain and stuff like that, or?
So we've done some brain stimulation stuff the last few years with surgeons and gamers, so TDCS, but we have FNIRS now, functional near-infrared spectroscopy, so again, oxygenation, deoxygenation in various areas. So we're, Sarah Cregan, a PhD student of mine, and Adams is looking at that in gaming at the moment, so we're just about to begin a big program of that, yeah.
Thanks.
I think we've got 2 or 3 minutes left. So, Carl.
Don't worry, I won't keep you. Thanks very much, all of the speakers. Learned loads. Mark, you're off the hook, though.
A few pieces.
Drew, coincidentally, I read, just for my own stuff, a paper belonging to you from 07 yesterday, the comparison between the dominant and non-dominant kinematics, and loved it. But on a side note for you, Drew, fascinating your own research here that you described today, and because you're so experienced, would you have expected this kind of reluctance from the IWF and comparative bodies to embrace your research, or are you a little bit disappointed?
I'm not really disappointed. I understand why, and really, I want to give you an idea of their perspective. They don't want a company to have a complete monopoly over everything, okay? But you can see that the technology that's in operation is actually not adequate to detect reaction time. It's so obvious, but they would like to see things done better, but they've not been served well by the technology companies like Seiko, Omega, Finish Links, who have basically implemented a 100 millisecond rule. And they're not research-based. They're just looking at building a timing system that will give reaction time. They haven't done any research. And so to break into that would require some sort of change in their technology. So you're actually upsetting the whole apple cart. And really, you have to realise that the timing systems are used for more than just reaction time. They're used for timing the race, all the different races. They're all built into the measurement of the jumps and the throws. And so they have a massive system. And so it's a little part of the system that we are, but it's an important part. So in one way, I'm disappointed that there's an inertia there, but change can be difficult. I think the first thing to do is to actually point out that there's a need for change, and I think they've come round to that view. So I'm fairly positive that they've come round to it, but they will not throw millions of dollars of funding to develop a new system until it actually shows that it can work. So we have to do the job first, and then the money would flow, which is kind of the nature of how things are.
Time for one last question. Anybody? Any takers? Tom.
Thanks, everyone. This is probably more an observation. I think with partnership with industry and national government bodies of sport, there's really good examples of how it can result in extra funding coming into that project, like with the Logitech or with the IRFU or horse racing, and how the outcomes have an impact on the sport and on health and PhD graduates and, you know, outputs, academic outputs. So it's a really good model of how it works. How would you think that could be packaged and sold to other industries or other national government bodies of sport to set up similar projects?
So it's a really good question. I think, you know, half of it's the selling job. So I think, you know, you could give exemplars and almost have workshops and education resources to show how it's done. I mean, just from, I think we all shared the same experience that it took a lot of work to maybe get that first PhD student funding. But once you did it, they were convinced and they wanted more of it. So I think it's a lot of it's around that kind of selling it. So maybe is it case studies? Is it an educational piece? And obviously working with key influencers like Sport Ireland, for example, to see how that can be done. Because, you know, I think, you know, for what they get for the investment they have, I think the returns are huge. So I think something around that space possibly. I don't know if others have comments.
Sorry. The timelines are really important. Athletes need quick results. And the governing bodies need quick results. And they're working off perhaps 4-year cycles for Olympics, but within a year they want something quickly back to help their athletes. That doesn't always work. Research takes time. So the timelines for them in governing bodies perhaps to engage with the HEIs, tell them this is what we might need next year. Sit down with all the governing bodies then and make a plan. So then it'll be a long-term solution to the problem. So those timelines are really important, and it's not always prevalent at the minute.
Thanks for that.
Okay, I think we'll draw it to a close there. So just to say thank you to our speakers and thank you to you, the audience, for coming to attend today. Thank you.